On today's episode of the Black Studies Podcast, we have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. W.E.B. Dr. B is a scholar of American and African American intellectual, cultural, and social history. A graduate of University of Toronto, she completed her postgraduate studies at Yale University under the supervision of David Breon Davis. In recent years, she has taught at the University of Pennsylvania, where she was the Roy F. and Jeanette P. Nichols Professor of American History. Before that, she taught at Rutgers University, where she also directed the Rutgers Center for Race and Ethnicity. Dr. B's most recent book is the Bancroft Prize-winning Traveling Black, A Story of Race and Resistance, which also received a Prose Award for Excellence in American History, the OAH's Liberty Legacy Award, the Lillian Smith Book Award, the Order of the Kolff Book Award, and the David J. Langham Prize in Legal History. Her other works include The White Image in the Black Mind, African American Ideas About White People, 1830 to 1925, To Tell the Truth Freely, The Life of Ida B. Wells, and the edited work, Ida B. Wells, The Light of Truth, The Writings of an Anti-Lynching Crusader. She is also the co-author with Waldo Martin and Deborah Gray White of the textbook Freedom on My Mind, A History of African Americans with Documents, and the editor of two collections of essays, Words and Intellectual History of Black Women, which she co-edited with Vera Jasmine Griffin, Martha S. Jones, and Barbara Savage, and Race and Retail, Consumption Across the Color Line, which she co-edited with Anne Fabian. Dr. B's current project include a new book on the history of African American ideas about Thomas Jefferson. Her work has been supported by the Starr Center for the Study of the American Experience, the Fletcher Foundation, the National Humanities Center, the Robert H. Smith International Center for Jefferson Studies at Monticello, the American Council of Learned Societies, Boston University's Institute on Race and Social Division, Harvard University's Charles Warren Center and W.E.B. Du Bois Centers, and the American Historical Association. An organization of American historians, distinguished lecturer, Dr. B is a member of the Gilder Lehrman Center's Advisory Board and has served on the editorial boards of Reviews in American History, the Journal of African American History, and the African American Intellectual History Society's Black Perspectives blog. Dr. B is a frequent consultant on museum and documentary film projects. Her public history work includes working with the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of African American History and Culture on one of its inaugural exhibits, Defending Freedom, Defining Freedom, The Era of Segregation, 1876 to 1968, and serving as a scholarly advisor to the Library of Congress and the NMAAHC's Civil Rights History Project. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Black Studies Podcast. Today, we have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. W.E.B. Paul Mellon, Professor of American History at the University of Cambridge. How are you doing today, Dr. B?
I'm doing very well. Thank you for having me on the podcast.
Thank you so much for being here. So we can dive in. How did you get into Black Studies and what keeps you committed to doing work that is aligned with Black Studies?
I've always been interested in African American history. I read some about it even when I was, in K-12. My mother, who's African American, very interested in it, and started to study it in college. And then I just never stopped. I mean, the thing about Black studies and Black history in particular is there's so much we don't know. There's so much information that we still need to get out there, that it's a subject that you never lose an interest in.
Yeah, for sure. What was it about Black history that really wanted you to continue learning more? I know there's so much we don't know. But were there particular topics or people or ideas that kind of kept you going back to it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was partially that, the history of ideas about race, which is something I have written a fair amount about. And that was interesting to me just because, when you go different places, there's sort of different ideas about race, different racial hierarchies. My family moved around a bit, and I kind of was like, why are people like this one place and like that another place? So I just became interested in how people thought about racial difference. That was one thing that got me going. And, a lot of stuff we study in Black studies have to do with segregation, inequality. It's, it's sort of a lot that sort of circles around the issue of race. So that I guess keeps me going.
Thank you. So you are in American history at Cambridge. You've studied at University of Toronto and at Yale, and are very well known for the work you've done in Black history. how do you situate yourself in relationship to like history versus Black studies?
Mhm. Well, I situate myself very much in both of them. I mean, I think that, African American history is American history. It's really central to American history. Any kind of American history that doesn't engage with it is sort of often missing, like, one of the major thing that's happening, and that's always been my position. When I went to Yale, I took courses mostly in American history because that's kind of what they had at the time, so I trained as an Americanist, which is actually helpful if you do African American history. Um, and When I subsequently went on to teach at Rutgers at the University of Pennsylvania, I have often taught both American and African American history. So I really do consider myself to work in both fields, with a special emphasis on African American history. But you really can't teach or study African American history without knowing American history, and it really should be the other way around, but it's not always the case.
Yeah, that's true. Um, do you find methodologically the field of history, if we're
Mhm,
thinking about the way that it has been traditionally taught, at least in the US,
mhm,
how do you see Black studies or African American history as pushing against some of the boundaries of
mhm.
what the traditional field of history does?
Well, I think that's another thing that I found kind of fascinating about African American history is it challenges us as historians to think about things like, how do you write about, the history of a people who haven't always been free to record their thoughts directly, haven't always had the literacy, the opportunity, all those things. How do you get at, the voices of people who haven't had much chance to sort of speak out, and what kind of sources do you use? And I've used, you know um, slave narratives, court cases, all kinds of things that are sort of, not necessarily traditional sources for people's voices, especially when it comes to sort of what they think about things. And I think that's one of the challenges that people who do African American history have had to meet, how to use kind of unconventional sources and how to be creative about thinking about getting at what is going on with people, even if they didn't leave behind great sources. And I think that the field has really been helpful to other fields in kind of pioneering work where you kind of try to get at, these voices of people who are not, abundant in the records.
For sure, that's something um, that has come up a lot in
Mhm,
conversations I've been able to have, especially with historians. And my sister is a historian, so
mhm,
we're always thinking about like, how are you getting at those voices? How are you really seeing the people beneath
mhm,
the archives that did not care or
mhm,
value them as people? So
mhm,
I do think that there has been a lot of really great work in history that allows for us to think about those things in different ways.
mhm.
So building on that, um, how do you see your work in the classroom as being impacted by your commitment to Black studies and focusing on African American history?
Well, I'm always trying to kind of, you know, not just sort of teach African American history when I teach it, or also when I teach American history, but also have students kind of think about the whole picture. So, if they have previously kind of not known, um, much about African American history, what is it that they do know about the Civil War or American democracy, and like, how do they make sense of what they learn about African American history in relationship to the knowledge that they already have? what's the big picture? What can they sort of usefully learn from studying African American history? So I try to kind of, you know, make it something that causes them to think critically about their society. And I also, try to communicate to them also just a sense of like, if this is surprising to you, understand that this is interesting. Like we have all this kind of new stuff we can learn. So like, look at these sources, think about what this means.
So this is a related question, not directly one that I sent you, but I'm interested in what it might mean or how we might approach teaching that work in this
Mhm.
moment.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's such a challenging question, and, because 'cause we're in such a weird moment around, like, does the truth matter? But, I mean, I do think the truth matters more than ever, and I guess, um, we have to kind of try to get the primary sources out there, try to kind of push back against things like, I mean, most recently, we had President Trump complaining that the African American Museum in DC at the Smithsonian focuses too much on what was bad about slavery. And it's like, how can one respond to that but by sort of just presenting the enormous amount of evidence of what was bad about slavery? Like, why why isn't he being challenged to tell us what was good about it? Because it's, that's not self-evident.
Yeah. It is, yeah. That it's a lot.
It
It's a
is.
lot. I know that there is um I just got an email the other day about a call for people to go and document the Smithsonian right now
Mhm.
before things potentially change and they start removing exhibits.
Well, that is, I
Um,
mean, that's the other thing that's really worrisome, and I feel like, people, archivists and museum professionals all over the country must be worried about, as well as historians, curators, like, just things disappearing, because, I mean, there's I don't know, sort of exactly what's going on, but yeah, I feel like I'm hoping people are kind of trying to keep a record of what's out there. You know, the Trumps of the world can't get rid of all the evidence. It's so abundant, but I can't even imagine what that museum would start to look like at, that first floor of the museum that sort of starts with the slave ship. How do you make that a better story, you know?
yeah. Yeah. I
I don't even know if he's been there, quite frankly. Like, I can't quite figure out what's going on with that.
No, I don't think he probably has. It seemed like a lot of the recommendations were coming from an article that was published by some conservative right wing
Mhm,
about different exhibits that have existed in the multiple iterations of the Smithsonian. Many of them are
mhm,
no longer even up, like they were limited edition
mhm,
things. So it was like, okay, but this not here anymore. So why are you telling us
mhm.
to remove something that no longer exists? So I don't think that there has actually been someone recently who has gone to many of these places and said, "Oh, this is too woke or that is too woke." They're just against
Any
the
kind
general
of
idea.
Yeah, well, I mean, that goes very well with the history of that museum, which was blocked from even being built, by Strom Thurmond for, decades. So, we kind of circle back to that.
Yeah, which, in teaching history, all of these things are circling back in ways. That I yeah. I don't necessarily think that they were envisioned in circling back as quickly as they did.
No, I think that
Right.
that was a shock. I mean, the one pattern that I kind of see in African American history that you have to reckon with students, and you kind of did even before that, was the ways in which, for African Americans, progress has often been a story of like, giant step forward and then a whole bunch of steps back. Like it just, like it's, I mean, it sort of illustrates that progress is very fragile, and that you can't count on it always continuing. And I feel like that's a message that doesn't really come across in sort of mainstream American history, where people often it's often kind of portrayed as this uninterrupted kind of movement towards greater democracy. And you just have to question that when it comes to African American history, and arguably to women's history as well. And it's so that one thing people have to be very aware of is that just because certain kinds of liberties have been achieved doesn't mean you don't have to defend them.
Absolutely. I think that that probably is even less understood when we're
Mhm,
talking about women's history, and in particular, if
mhm,
we're talking about Black women's history,
mhm,
that's a whole 'nother conversation because so much of the progress that was made doesn't necessarily highlight in the mainstream conversations Black women themselves.
mhm,
Um, yeah. So I've been thinking a lot about the ways in which we can, impress upon students that history,
mhm,
yes, the forward and back nature of
mhm,
it so that it's not overwhelmingly hopeless
mhm.
in these moments.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to think about it as, a kind of almost way to approach justice and injustice in our lives. And I think of this only because it's sort of one thing I felt like I learned from doing a biography of Ida B. Wells. She had in the final chapter of her autobiography, she calls herself the watcher on the wall, and she says she's like the watcher on the walls who guard Jerusalem, and like never rest and never stop guarding, because they have to be on guard against danger and injustice. And it is kind of like, we have to see American liberties as fragile. And I think it's sometimes been hard to convince people of that, but I think right now it's very clear that they are fragile.
Yeah.
And they can't be taken for granted.
Yeah, I think they're a lot more fragile than people consider them to be.
Mhm.
So so you mentioned your book about, Ida B. Wells,
Mhm.
and I know you wrote a book, Traveling Black,
Mhm.
Story of Race and Resistance. You've, worked on Toward an Intellectual History of Black Women, like, several books that are really integral for thinking about how we approach Black history in the US and how people think about race in the US. Um, what I guess trying to think of the best way to word this. What led you to go down the different, trajectories of your book? Like, what
Mhm.
drove those different threads of research?
Um, I think they're all more connected than they might seem at first glance. One of the things that made me eager to write about Ida B. Wells after publishing my first book, The White Image and the Black Mind, which was about African American ideas about white people, was that, especially when it came to discussing the ideas of educated Black people about white people. I really didn't have that much material from Black women who didn't typically write about race or talk about it all that explicitly. Um, so I became interested in women's racial thought and interested in sort of looking for 19th century Black female thinkers. So when I was approached to write a biography of someone, Wells was someone who really appealed to me because she was a journalist and she was very outspoken. And she was also kind of interesting as an intellectual because unlike most of the most of the male intellectuals you read about and study, especially in the 19th century, she hadn't really even finished high school. She didn't, so she didn't have an education. She wasn't immediately, she didn't have like a circle of educated friends. So, part of what I found kind of fascinating about her and other women of this period, Black women of this period, is like, how do you develop your ideas when you're kind of not in these kind of circles that we usually think of as circles where people generate ideas. So it was, I was interested in, that was part of sort of how I got towards an intellectual history of Black women. And ironically, it was also part of how I got to the book about travel, because when I looked at Ida B. Wells and saw what most immediately made her become a journalist, it was the experience of being kicked off of what used to be called the ladies' car on a train, which was a car that was supposed to sort of be reserved for women and their travel companions. But by the 1880s, when she was traveling on one, they were beginning to kind of not welcome Black women in these cars, and she was kicked off, and she sued, and she won in the lower courts, but then lost later. And she really had to kind of grapple with um, you know, the idea that in the court system they were challenging her ability to qualify as a lady, even though she was by that time a teacher, dressed middle class, able to afford a first class ticket, and that was sort of part of her beginning to understand how race was really so much complicating like gender for Black women, and that Black women were not, they were not just subject to racism, but they were subject to a sexism in which their gender was not really recognized, and how race and gender were sort of tangled together in a lot of the racial prejudice that Blacks were experiencing in her era, which is something she really talks about in all of her work on lynching and other things. And I mean, because she had this experience on the railroad, I really had to kind of conclude that, for her, some of her insights were just born around kind of dealing with moving around in the segregated South, and that experience, and that sort of got me interested in travel, because I was thinking, I hadn't known when I first started studying Wells that there had been this system of ladies' cars that preceded the colored white divide on the railroad cars, in which, as they moved towards segregation, they sort of abandoned the ladies' cars and made them either white or colored cars. Still with the better car being the white car. And that made me curious about how other forms of segregation had taken shape in the South, like what happened after, what happened on buses, on boats, on airplanes. And that was sort of that's how that book sort of got started.
Thank you. That that definitely makes sense. Like as you said, it is definitely related. The Ida B. Wells, the story of her being kicked off the train, that is probably one of the the stories that I remember most from reading about an undergrad because it caused a big fight in our class that day when
Mhm.
we talked about that story. Yeah.
What were
So,
people fighting about?
we had people. First of all, my classes were 95, if not 99% white. But
Mhm.
there was a conversation about, how they said she didn't belong in the ladies' car. Uh and they so we were talking about her getting kicked out, and somebody wanted to play devil's advocate.
Mhm.
Because when they were removing her, she fought
Mhm.
back. And they were like, well, that
Mhm.
wasn't very ladylike. So wasn't she just proving their point?
Mm. Well, I mean, that was something that some of Anna Julie Cooper, another Black woman of that era, actually there's a quote in which she says, like, when you start experiencing this terrible disrespect on train cars, you're torn because, and this is where I kind of got to like some of the silences. You want to, you want to protest, as she said, with wrathful, which by in the 19th century was a very strong word, like you want to curse them out, right? Um, but if you do, they're going to say that you are, that you're not a
Mhm.
lady. So like, you're like, she was kind of like, what are we supposed to do? Are we supposed to remain? So you sort of saw why people remain silent, because the burden on them is to remain silent. But, you know, it's a catch 22.
Yeah. Yeah. It definitely it is a catch-22. Um,
And there's always, there's a long, even today, there's this thing about Black women and rage and like,
yeah. Yeah.
right, that an idea that a wrathful Black woman is somehow showing her race as opposed to expressing a legitimate grievance is already sort of out there in the world, right?
Yes. Yes. And so in that conversation, that was also like, okay, it was hard to not be wrathful in
Right.
that conversation. And even in not, you know, we didn't it was me and I think it was one or two other Black women who were in the class. Um And we definitely pushed back, but
Mhm,
not at all. Like, we didn't curse
mhm,
anybody out but,
mhm,
like,
mhm.
even just put the pushback was considered to be hostile. It's like,
Yeah.
well, what did you just said that she wasn't a lady because they kicked her out of the lady car, and she protested to that. Like, I
Mhm.
don't but we're hostile, though. So, yeah, just that the levels in that particular conversation are probably the most vivid memory I have of a class of undergrad, honestly. That day was a lot, but, this I the traveling across different spaces is super interesting because I do think we hear a lot about buses,
Mhm,
because the Rosa Parks story is one of the only ones that actually gets taught in
mhm.
K-12 classrooms. But not necessarily in some of the other spaces that people had to travel. Um,
Yeah, and there was that was, that book did not actually start out as a book project. It was initially just kind of curiosity, and when I started to look at, you know, where people had problems, it just never ended, like, I remember somebody was like, "Well, what about stagecoaches?" And I was like, "Stagecoaches? Oh, okay, let's see." And yeah, yep, there's kick down, drag out fights on stagecoaches, like, because people are being tossed off them. So it's just everywhere, but part of how we kind of understand the civil rights movement is as if Rosa Parks was like the first person to protest this, whereas the protests actually go back to the age of stagecoaches prior to the invention of buses or trains or anything like that.
yeah. I mean, even if you just look at, um, the, uh, Frederick Douglass and the ways in
Mhm,
which he had to travel differently than
mhm,
the Garrisonians when he's touring
mhm.
for his autobiography, like, there's always been differences.
Mhm.
in the US around how Black people were permitted to get places, um,
Mhm.
and where they could move, not
Mhm.
just the how, but the where.
Right.
So, any, anything else you wanna say about your research, um, or any current projects you're working on before we move into our final 2 questions?
Yeah, I'll just say I'm currently working on a couple of different projects. I'm doing one that's on streetcars because traveling black was really about people traveling long distances. But I've been sort of intrigued by streetcars because they were such a sight of like knockdown, drag out racial conflict in a way that I don't think has been fully appreciated. Streetcars remained mostly not segregated until the early 20th century, not because nobody ever thought of segregating them, but because Black resistance to it was intense and pretty successful. So I want to kind of recapture some of that story. And then I've also circled back to a project that I started a long time ago on African American ideas about Thomas Jefferson, who is someone I came across a lot in the writings of 19th century Black thinkers when I was writing my first book. And I'm I'm sort of writing a book about that and how he kind of appears, and what he stands for as a president and as a figure with very complicated views on race and slavery.
Yeah. That should be very interesting
I
because
think so.
a lot can be said about Thomas Jefferson and his views on race and slavery and the implications of that.
Mhm.
Um, yeah. Okay, so thank you. I'm looking forward to those, projects. Um, so last 2 questions. I
Okay.
can give you back your time. I know we're on a big time difference, so let you enjoy the rest of your day.
Mhm.
Um, so and this might have multiple points to it, and you've kinda
Mhm.
touched on some of it, but what
Mhm.
interests you most about the past of Black studies? In both, like, exciting senses, but also maybe critical.
I mean, I guess what interests me most about the past generally, and it's true in Black study with others, is it is really, you know, it is really a different time, and it's sort of a bit of a mystery. So, like, just trying to kind of reconstruct what is really going on in the past, what people are really thinking and feeling is always kind of fascinating, and just sort of trying to sort of get at the experience of living in another time, and that just continues to fascinate me.
What interests or excites you most about the future? Or maybe even where should Black studies as a field be going?
Well, I mean, I think right now we are at a really challenging point when it comes to the future. I mean, I think Black Studies has to double down on all of its sort of traditional, sort of speaking truth to power tendencies of like trying to really get at the truth about the past, trying to speak critically about American history, about trying not to sugarcoat things. It's probably, and and I do feel like African American studies is now going to have to do that in a much more hostile environment, and it's going to be challenging. So I guess I'm excited, but I'm also apprehensive, right? At sort of, what's going to happen in the field. I mean, the one thing you can say is that people, African American Black studies had sort of built itself up in a hostile environment, survived a lot of, many years where people just kind of ignored it. So people will have to draw on, the tradition of like
Mhm.
making this work somehow. And in that regard, I mean, they have this thing that when you teach the Depression, people are often one of the things that a lot of historians say about the Depression is that for African Americans, the Depression was in certain ways not as bad because African Americans were so used to being poor. And at this moment, perhaps for African Americans, the sort of sheer level of repression that's coming is not as new as it might be for some other groups. So it's time for everyone to draw on all the traditions that have allowed them to survive in the past.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. At least in terms of, I don't think as many Black people are surprised
Mhm.
as other people are surprised about what's happening.
Right. No, they're not as surprised and not as, this can't be happening or this will stop happening.
Yeah. Like, no, it's happened before, and we
Yeah.
told you it would happen again, and here
Yeah,
we are.
exactly.
Yeah. Well, I think that there is, as you said, like, there is a history, there is a tradition of strategies for keeping the work going, and then there's also the fact that Black studies has only been in the field, like, it's only been in the academy for a
Mhm.
little over 50 years.
Mhm.
So, what it looks like in the academy might change, but we know that Black studies and intellectual work being done about, through, and for Black people is gonna continue regardless. So,
Absolutely.
maybe it'll look different, but it'll be here.
Mhm. That's true.
Thank you so, so much. Anything you want to add before I give you back your time?
I just wanna thank you for doing the podcast. It's a great contribution to have work like yours out there in the world for people to listen to.
Well, thank you. Thank you for your work, and thank you so
Mhm.
much for talking with me today. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
You too. Thank you.